The question I get asked more than any other is some version of the same thing. How much land do you actually need? Is it actually possible for a family to grow its own food through a full year without a grocery store filling the gaps? The honest answer is not the simple one. It is not yes, and it is not no. It is this: a family willing to plan across the whole year, willing to put up food through the summer months for the winter months, willing to raise a modest amount of livestock alongside the garden, and willing to work the soil with intention, can meet between 70 and 90% of its food needs on a half acre to 2 acres of productive land. The remaining 10 to 30%, grains mostly, and some specialty items, comes from outside. That is the honest picture, and everything I'm going to show you today is how you get as close to the top of that range as your land and your effort allow. I am Levi Yoder. I was raised plain here in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, on a farm that produced most of what the family ate across the year. My grandfather did not think of this as self-sufficiency in the modern sense. He thought of it as the ordinary management of a household, the same way his father and his father before him had managed it. The garden fed the table in summer. The root cellar and the canning shelves and the smokehouse fed the table in winter. The animals on the farm produced what the garden could not, and the two together left almost nothing to be purchased. I watched this system for the years of my childhood, and I have been working to rebuild it on my own ground ever since. I am going to show you the framework that makes it work, which has not changed because the principles underneath it have not changed. Before I show you, let me say this plainly. If you want the full collection of the old homestead methods that were handed down in our family, from the garden and orchard to the pantry, cellar, and the everyday keeping of a house, I have gathered them into one simple ebook. You will find it in the description below. Now, let us get back to the topic. The first principle, and the one that most people working toward a year-round food supply violate most consistently, is that you are not planning a garden. You are planning a pantry. Those two things are completely different in how they determine what you grow and how much you grow of it. A garden planner asks what the family enjoys eating and plants things they will use fresh through the summer. A pantry planner asks what the family needs through the winter months of January, February, and March when nothing is growing, and plants backward from that need. The garden is in service of the pantry, and the pantry is the whole point. If your shelves are full by September and empty by Christmas, you planned a summer garden. If your shelves carry you through to the following May, you planned a food system. The difference is almost entirely in the quantities planted and the proportion of the garden allocated to storable crops versus fresh crops. Storable crops are the foundation of a year-round food system, and they occupy a much larger share of the productive ground than most beginning homesteaders expect. Potatoes, sweet potatoes, winter squash, dried beans, and dried corn together provide the caloric base and the dietary starch a family needs through a winter. A single 100-foot row of potatoes planted in mid-April and harvested in late August produces between 50 and 100 pounds of storage potatoes, depending on variety and soil. A family of 4 needs roughly 300 to 400 pounds of potatoes to eat potatoes twice a week through a 7-month winter. That requires 3 to 4 100-foot rows, which occupies approximately 1,200 square feet of growing space. Most people plant 1 row and run out of potatoes in November. The arithmetic of the pantry, once you sit down with it, tells you exactly how much to plant, and the number is almost always larger than you thought. The same arithmetic applies to winter squash, dried beans, and onions. A butternut squash vine takes significant space but produces 4 to 8 squash per plant, each of which stores for 4 to 6 months without refrigeration and feeds a family at a single meal. A row of dried beans planted in May and left to fully mature and dry on the vine through September produces 2 to 3 pounds of dried beans per 10 feet of row. Dried beans store for years and are among the most calorie-dense crops a home garden can produce. Plant them in volume. Plant enough that you run out in the following August, not in November. If you run out in November, you planted about half of what you needed. Preservation is the bridge between the summer surplus and the winter need, and it is the skill that determines whether the garden actually feeds the family in January or whether the family is back at the grocery store by December. Canning, freezing, fermenting, dehydrating, and root cellaring are not optional additions to the homestead food system. They are the mechanism through which the food system works. A garden without a preservation strategy is a summer activity. A garden combined with a preservation strategy that begins in July and runs through September is a food supply. My grandfather and grandmother put up food through every summer of their lives in this farmhouse, and the work of those 3 months is what made the winter possible. The root cellar under this kitchen held potatoes, carrots, turnips, beets, cabbage, and canned goods, enough to carry the family from September through the following April. Nothing in that cellar was produced outside of this property. Everything in it was grown here, processed here, and stored here. The animal component of the homestead food system provides what the garden cannot produce in adequate volume or nutritional density. A small flock of laying hens, somewhere between 8 and 12 birds for a family of 4, produces eggs through most of the year and provides meat at the end of a hen's laying life. A flock of meat chickens raised in 2 batches through the spring and summer provides the poultry supply for the year at a fraction of the cost of store-bought chicken. A dairy animal, even a single dairy goat, provides milk, cream, butter, and cheese if you learn the basic cheese-making skills that every farmhouse woman in this county knew 50 years ago. A pair of pigs raised from spring through the autumn on garden scraps, whey from the cheese, and supplemental grain converts what would be waste into a year's supply of pork, lard, and sausage. My grandfather ran all of these simultaneously on a few acres, and the animals together made the nutrition possible that the garden alone could not have provided. The orchard is the component that takes the longest to establish and the one most people delay too long. Fruit trees take 5 to 7 years from planting to full production, which means the right time to plant them is the year you decide to work toward a food-producing homestead, not the year you feel ready. Apple trees, pear trees, and plum trees in a small collection of 6 to 12 trees will eventually produce more fruit than a family can consume fresh, which makes the surplus an opportunity for canning, drying, and cider. My grandfather planted the trees that fed this farm's fruit needs before my father was born, and I am now eating fruit from trees he put in the ground 60 years ago. Plant the orchard first and let it grow while you are working on everything else. The land area required for what I have described, a substantial vegetable garden, a flock of laying hens, a batch of meat chickens per year, a dairy goat or 2, a pair of pigs, and a small orchard, falls between 1/2 acre and 2 acres, depending on how intensively you manage the ground and how willing you are to purchase supplemental feed for the animals rather than growing it yourself. On a 1/2 acre managed intensively with permanent raised beds, year-round production in season extenders, and high-yield varieties selected for storage quality, a family of 4 can realistically meet 70 to 75% of its food needs. On 2 acres with more conventional spacing and the full animal complement, that number rises toward 90%. The remaining percentage, primarily grains and oils, is difficult to grow in the volume needed on small acreage and is where most homesteaders sensibly rely on local sources rather than attempting full grain production at small scale. The planting calendar is what makes it all work, and it is the tool I would give someone starting this journey before I gave them any seed or any chick. The planning calendar runs from January through December and maps every task in every category, what seeds to order and when, what to start in the greenhouse and what to direct sow and when to order chicks, when to rotate the pigs to fresh ground, when to harvest and what to preserve and how. Without that calendar, the system works in pieces during the months when each piece is obvious and fails during the months when the next action is not immediately apparent. With the calendar, nothing falls through the gap between seasons. My grandfather carried his in his head because he had done it so many years that the sequence was automatic. On my own ground, I keep it written and I review it in December for the year ahead. That December review is when next year's food supply is actually built, in the planning, before a single seed is ordered. The honest accounting of what you gain from this work goes beyond the economics, though the economics are real. The average American family spends $8,000 to $12,000 on food per year, and a well-managed homestead of the kind I have described can reduce that number dramatically while improving the quality of every meal. What you also gain is the knowledge that the food on your table has a complete and known history, that it was grown in soil you have been building for years, that no unknown inputs touched it between the seed and your plate. My grandfather ate from this farm for 60 years and was healthy into his 80s. I believe in the connection between those two facts without being able to prove it, but I believe it enough to build my family's life the same way. Tell me in the comments where you are on this journey, whether you are planning a food system for the first time or have been working at it for several years already. And tell me your county and your state while you were there. The conditions you are working with are completely different in Arizona than they are in Vermont. And I always want to know who is out there and what they are dealing with. I read every single one. Next time I'm going to show you the specific varieties I plant for storage quality rather than fresh flavor. The tomatoes that hold on the shelf through November, the potatoes that keep through April, and the squash that is still good on the table in February, and why most of the varieties sold at the garden center are optimized for fresh eating rather than for keeping. The people who built this country with their own two hands knew things we are only just now truly beginning to remember.